Yeah, I'll react to that, sure. Okay. Hello, guys. One more video down here, and then I should be able to move back to my normal video recording at my room. Let's do it. My name is Connor. I like to learn about things. Battle of Austerlitz, Napoleon's greatest victory, preemptive like, world graphics, great channel. Any channel that has this guy on it is just amazing. He's a great narrator. Yeah, original link to the video, top of the description, right below that, link to the Discord. Click on it, send you right over there. Love to have you. Let's go. So, yeah, I learned a lot about Napoleon through the Epic History TV series, and I've learned a bit through separate videos since, but it was one go-through, and it takes me a few go-throughs of a topic to really have certain things stick with me, and so going back into Napoleon, let's do it.
Europe had been in turmoil for years. France had been through a revolution and the bloody reign of terror that followed. Meanwhile, European colonial possessions in the Americas were also getting restless, where the seeds had already been well and truly sown for war and independence. Indeed, it was the French king, Louis XVI's extravagant support of the American revolutionaries that had brought revolution to his very own doorstep, the Chateau of Versailles, whose exorbitant construction costs had been rankling with his subjects for years. In the end, it would cost him his own head, quite literally, under the blade of the invention that was very much a la mode at the time, the guillotine. Yet it wouldn't be revolution that would change the face of Europe at the beginning of the 19th century, but war. The Napoleonic Wars. In the years that immediately followed its revolution, France had been forced to defend itself against an outraged European monarchy who were not all too keen to suffer the same fate as their confrère, Louis XVI, and were hell-bent on returning France to the reassuring feudal order of the Ancien regime. Organized in two loose alliances called unimaginatively the First and Second Coalitions, a motley group of aristocratic armies that included Holland, Great Britain, the Holy Roman Empire, Austria, Russia, the Ottoman Empire, Portugal, and Naples tried in vain to undo the undoable. These were the French Revolutionary Wars, and they lasted almost exactly a decade, from 1792 until 1802. It was during one of these revolutionary wars, the War of the First Coalition, that a little-known general began his first campaign in Italy. This was April 1796, and the general was called Napoleon Bonaparte. In less than a year, he managed to eject the entire Austrian army from the northern Italian states, forcing the Austro-Hungarian monarchy.
Am I right with Toulon, or am I thinking of something else?
The entire Austrian army from the northern Italian states, forcing the Austro-Hungarian monarchy, the Habsburgs, to sue for peace, which led to the signing of the Treaty of Campo Formio, revolutionary France's first great victory, and a real consolidation of its position on the Italian peninsula with the founding of the Ligurian and Cisalpine republics, French client states that spread across Genoa, Lombardy, and the valley of the River Po. Now, we'll return to Napoleon's favorite enemy, the Habsburgs.
This makes me think about all the amazing people who were born, who could have been very great men or great women, great people, but were just not born in the right time to really pursue that greatness. And obviously Napoleon is born
and the valley of the
during
River
that
Po.
time.
Now, we'll return to Napoleon's favorite enemy, the Habsburgs, a little later, but for now, we must go to Egypt. In 1798, France invaded Egypt, led by that same General Napoleon Bonaparte. After annihilating the Egyptian and Ottoman armies in battles of the Pyramids, Mount Tabor, and Abu Qir, he returned to Paris in triumph in autumn of 1799. Although the Egyptian campaign ultimately ended in failure, with France's defeat against the Royal Navy in the Battle of the Nile, it did not prevent Napoleon from riding on his notoriety and organizing a coup d'etat, the coup of 18 Brumaire, which led to the founding of the French consulate, and ultimately ended in failure in autumn of 1799. Although the campaign ultimately ended in failure, with France's defeat against the Royal Navy in the Battle of the Nile, it did not prevent Napoleon from riding on his notoriety and organizing a coup d'etat, the coup of 18 Brumaire, which led to the founding of the French consulate, an autocratic regime in which he, as first consul, would rule by decree, thereby becoming its de facto dictator. While the war in Egypt had not been overwhelmingly decisive, with neither France or England claiming an absolute victory, it was clear which way things were going. Following the recent overthrow of Prime Minister William Pitt, a strengthened France led the British, who were already fatigued from years of combat, to sign the Treaty of Amiens in 1802, which gave considerable concessions to Napoleon's negotiators, including the cession of all recent British conquests and, notably, the strategic Mediterranean island of Malta. However, when he returned to office in 1803, William Pitt felt Malta was just a little too much of a giveaway. He refused to evacuate the island, a decision that would ultimately lead to the War of the Third Coalition, the Napoleonic Wars proper, and what is probably Napoleon's greatest victory in the Battle of Austerlitz. What followed William Pitt's refusal could only be described as a Cold War of sorts that rather quickly heated up. Malta became the tipping point, like a bygone Kuwait, that eventually drew Europe yet again into conflict, the third major continental conflagration since the French Revolution. While Napoleon built up
did I learn that? I
fortifications on the English Channel in Boulogne since the French Revolution. While Napoleon built up fortifications on the English Channel in Boulogne and Bruges, he amassed and trained an army of 200,000 men that he would baptize the Armée de Côte de l'Océan, and eventually the Armée d'Angleterre, the Army of England, which did little to disguise his real intentions. Of course, it would not be the Army of England, but rather for England, for the invasion of England. During the preparations, he even considered using a fleet of troop-carrying balloons, the height of technology at the time, and digging a tunnel sous le Manche, a channel tunnel that would facilitate the transport of supplies. It took a statement of the blindingly obvious from his aviation advisor and aeronaut of the official festivals, Madame Blanchard, wife of ballooning pioneer Jean-Pierre Blanchard, to curb the enthusiasm of the aspiring emperor. The prevailing winds would be in the wrong direction for a channel crossing of this sort.
I know some people must have been expecting him to be like, whoa, they're flying over the... It's just, I knew about the hot air balloon technology that was there, so it's cool, but I wasn't as surprised.
Prevailing winds would be in the wrong direction for a channel crossing of this sort. Meanwhile, the British built up fortifications in and around Dover, along with a wider scattering of small circular masonry forts known as Martello Towers. Yet, the War of the Third Coalition did not start with a military invasion, but with economic blockades. While the British, who ruled the waves, used their Royal Navy to prevent the French and their largely Spanish allies from accessing colonial markets, Napoleon closed much of continental Europe to British produce, resulting in a real crisis for the cotton mills of Liverpool and Manchester. This was interspersed in colonial markets. Napoleon closed much of continental Europe to British produce, resulting in a real crisis for the cotton mills of Liverpool and Manchester. This was interspersed with occasional skirmishes, such as the raid on Boulogne in October 1804, which achieved little and turned out to be a bit of a damp squib for the British strategists. In many ways, a stalemate ensued, with the French unable to equal the power of the mighty Royal Navy, while on land, the British knew that they simply could not match the efficient, singularly meritocratic and ferocious fighting force of Napoleon's Grand Army. This was the bloated behemoth that his Armée d'Angleterre would eventually morph into. But it would take Napoleon's defeat in the Battle of Trafalgar in October 1805 to bury his planned invasion of the British Isles for good. Although the British were outnumbered in ships and firepower, the blundering maneuvers of Napoleon's Admiral Villeneuve around the southern Spanish port of Cadiz would lead to ultimate defeat for the French. The English Admiral Horatio Nelson might have had something to do with that as well. While the British and French navies skirmished on the high seas and along the coast, something to do with
he's doing the coat thing too. Or does he not have an arm?
that as well. While the British and French navies skirmished on the high seas and along the coasts of the English Channel, the Mediterranean, and the Iberian Peninsula, a number of events occurred which would gradually lead to the formation of a third coalition of European military powers against France. On the 21st of March 1804, Louis-Antoine de Bourbon, Duke of Enghien, was executed for treason by the French consulate. While living in exile in Ettenheim, which then lay in the southern German-speaking Dukedom of Baden, he had been kidnapped on Napoleon's orders by a crack unit of French dragoons and brought to trial in Paris on largely trumped-up charges. The accusations against the Bourbon Duke included consorting with known counter-revolutionaries such as Jean-Charles Pichegru, Georges Cararal, and Charles-François Dumouriez, spying for the enemy.
French is such an interesting language. It sounds... It's unique.
Georges Cararal and
I know it's a romance language technically, right?
Charles-François Dumouriez, spying for the enemy from his alleged contacts with British spy master William Wickham and conspiring to form a coalition of armies against the French Republic with the express purpose of removing the first consul himself from power. Following what was essentially a show trial, he was taken to the chateau of Vincennes and summarily executed in its moat by firing squad. "I must die then at the hands of Frenchmen," were his reported last words. The question of whether the Duke was guilty falls into insignificance, however, when taken in the context of the effect that his killing had on a jumpy European aristocracy who, following the mass guillotinings of the Reign of Terror, could no longer scratch their necks without feeling unpleasant cold shivers running down their spines. There can be little uncertainty that the charges against the executed Duke were largely fabricated or at least exaggerated, and whilst in his life he would have been unlikely to have sufficient appui to muster a substantial coalition of military powers against France, in death his influence turned out to be astounding. The killing would be the early 19th century's equivalent of the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, that critical event that triggered World War I. In particular, it mobilized the Russian Tsar Alexander I, who regarded Napoleon's clandestine sortie into Baden as an infringement of the sovereignty of the Holy Roman Empire, which he considered to be well and truly within Russia's military and economic sphere of influence, cemented in particular by the elaborate family ties that he had to its various fiefdoms. The foundations of the Third Coalition of Armies against the Napoleonic French Empire had now been firmly laid. Despite the chaos that ensued, Napoleon never regretted his decision to order the assassination of Louis-Antoine de Bourbon. Critically, it silenced almost...
Guys, let me know if I'm wrong here, but it seems like, you know how how the Egyptian pharaohs tended to be Greek, ruling over, so I'm assuming, some Greek citizenship and some native Egyptian. Was Russia sort of the same thing? Like were the monarchs of Russia not really Russian and just kind of controlled it, and they it just seems like all of the monarchs are very linked together, sometimes often by blood, by being relatives, and they're just kind of jumping across nations and often fearing their citizenry more than their neighbors or whatnot.
Influence cemented in particular by the elaborate family ties that he had to its various fiefdoms. The foundations of the Third Coalition of Armies against the Napoleonic French Empire had now been firmly laid. Despite the chaos that ensued, Napoleon never regretted his decision to order the assassination of Louis-Antoine de Bourbon. Critically, it silenced almost all opposition to his elevation to Emperor of the French. The title was given to him by a rubber-stamping Senate conservateur within 2 months following the execution on the 18th of May 1804. He was crowned on the 2nd of December that same year. After all, he doesn't want to become an emperor. William Pitt, already vexed by Bonaparte's admittedly disastrous 1803 expedition to Haiti to crush the ongoing slaves uprising there, and now angered by the killing of the Duke of Enghien, spent most of the years 1804 and 1805 in a flurry of diplomatic activity, which resulted in treaties with Sweden in December 1804 and with Russia in April 1805. Remarkably, the Treaty of St. Petersburg was signed despite Tsar Alexander I's distrust for the British due to their prior support for Russia's territorial arch-rival to the south, the Ottomans. These were past differences that the Tsar would not...
I was about to say, yeah, they remember the Croatian War, but that's 50 years... The Croatian War, that's 50 years in the future. Not the Croatian War. Crimean War. Croatian War. I'm an idiot. Continue. Jesus Christ. I just feel like a lot of French history fans or Napoleonic history fans are not liking me right now.
Normally overlook, but these were not normal times. Meanwhile, the Austrians, already displeased with Napoleon's land grabs on the Italian peninsula and other incursions into their territory, were also finally spurred into action by the events of 1804. Now the Habsburgs' Holy Roman Empire, along with the Kingdom of Naples, were thrust into the third coalition against France. All that remained was Prussia, way up north from the safety of his...
I was waiting for Prussia. I'm in the gray, boys. Nobody...
France. All that remained was Prussia, way up north from the safety of his Berlin bunker, read his flamboyant Rococo Sanssouci palace in Potsdam. Kaiser Friedrich Wilhelm III had been taking very much a softly wait-and-see approach to the whole affair, and this was not without immense diplomatic pressure from the English and especially the Russians for him to join their colossal band of aristocratic desperados that they intended would waylace France's expansionary aspirations for good. The Prussian king had observed events of recent years with some trepidation and was particularly concerned about the ignominious thrashing his former Habsburg ally Francis II had suffered in northern Italy.
It's interesting how he's Wilhelm III. Anyways.
The hands of Bonaparte's troops. Before he took any decision, he would need to northern Italy at the hands of Bonaparte's troops. Before he took any decision, he would need to reassure himself that a similar fate could not befall him. He would have to be sure that a simple left hook from the monstrous Grande Armée would not be enough to erase his Germanic kingdom from the maps for good. The Kaiser's tergiversations were not, however, without qualms. France, during its conquests of Holland and northern Germany, had offered Hanover to the Prussian king in exchange for his neutrality, a prized possession given its connections to the British monarchy at the time. But Napoleon's wanton marching of his troops through Ansbach and Bayreuth in early October 1805 without seeking any kind of permission from the king was an incursion too many. For Friedrich Wilhelm, the Rubicon had been crossed, which now left his other ear wide open to Alexander I's already persistent overtures. The Treaty of Potsdam between Russia and Prussia was signed later that month. The Prusso-Russian plan was that Friedrich Wilhelm III would deliver an ultimatum. France would give up its expansionary pretensions along with huge swaths of conquered territory, or Prussia would pile into the brawl. Of course, this was unacceptable for the recently crowned French emperor. With hindsight, the Prussian ultimatum might have seemed misguided, but prior to its issuance, a number of concomitant events had converged to strengthen Friedrich Wilhelm's resolve. The Habsburg brothers were now back on the offensive in Italy, with Francis II's younger sibling and Archduke Charles preparing for the major engagement in Caldiero. Meanwhile, the Russian General Kutuzov had admirably held and even consolidated his positions to the east. News of what was essentially the scuttling of the French fleet at Trafalgar through Admiral Villeneuve's maladroit seamanship may have had an effect as well, but the clincher for the Kaiser was intelligence that Napoleon's Grande Armée was disorganized, lacking provisions, and generally unfit for battle. The Allied cause could only succeed. Of course, this intelligence was incorrect and, without doubt, had been carefully seeded by French agents. With the now emboldened Austrians led by their slightly idiosyncratic commander Karl Freiherr Mack von Lieberich surging towards the Black Forest, which was virtually on France's doorstep, Napoleon took quick and decisive action. He would head them off with a colossal 200,000-strong contingent of troops from his Grande Armée, which until then had been stationed in Boulogne in preparation for the soon-to-be abandoned invasion of England. Whether Karl Freiherr Mack von Lieberich suddenly lost his nerve, or whether he felt that the Habsburg armies had become too thinned out, with various divisionary forces having been sent out as far and wide as Naples and Sweden, is a matter of debate, but his fateful decision to stop well short of the Black Forest and hold the line at Ulm would certainly haunt him for the rest of his life. While he might have been better served by taking his army south to join up with other Austrian and Allied forces, the city of Ulm gave the appearance of being a virtually impenetrable fortress on an eminently defensible plain. It would also allow the Austrians...
It seems almost indented.
virtually impenetrable fortress on an eminently defensible plain. It would also allow the Austrians to control key routes, including passes into the hilly Black Forest, which Mack considered a useful way of forcing Napoleon's hand. Conflicting intelligence, the adroit divisionary cavalry movements of Napoleon's General Murat, as well as the sweep through the Ansbach and Bayreuth, which would soon strengthen Friedrich Wilhelm's resolve, also strengthened the Austrian commanders' resolve to dig in. When the French got wind of Mack's entrenchment at Ulm, they quickly doubled back and occupied the town of Donauwörth, about a day's ride to the east.
What's with them doing the kind of like salute there? Kind of World War II Germany salute thing. Trying to say certain words so I don't get...
The generals Soult and Dever of Donauwörth, about a day's ride to the east. The generals Soult and Dever were the first to arrive, soon to be followed by swarms of other units. By the time Karl Mack von Liebrecht realized the danger he was in and the folly of his decision to occupy Ulm without any prospect of rapid reinforcements from his allies, it was probably already too late. He lost his nerve and sent Feldmarsch Lieutenant Franz Xavier Alfenberg's unit of 5,500 cavalry and infantry to Wertingen to prepare their escape route. But what was supposed to be a dignified retreat turned out to be the almost complete and utter distraction of the Habsburg Expeditionary Force. The Battle of Wertingen in the early days of October 1805 was almost too easy of a victory for Napoleon, bringing distinction to his general Joachim Murat, Louis Klein, Marc-Antoine de Beaumont, Nansouty, and Nicolas Oudinot. In a fit of desperation, Mack then decided to try to capture and hold several strategic bridges that would give him access to the northern banks of the Danube. And while the Gunsberg crossings were at first easily secured, Napoleon's general Jean-Pierre Firmin-Malher soon captured them for the French in a flurry of ferocious fighting at the Battle of Gunsberg, which saw over 200 Tyrolean Jaegers, along with their Flemish commander Constantine Guillain Carl d'Aspre, taken prisoner. Meanwhile, the fighting intensified further, still on the southern banks of the Danube, which eventually allowed the French to capture a significant and strategic patch of territory there. While the Austrians tried desperately to repair the bridges that were in their possession, they fought desperately to take back those that were not. But when yet another Napoleonic general, Louis-Henri Luçon, took the admittedly lightly defended Danube bridges in Elchingen, it proved to be a bridge too far. Mack ordered the retreat of his army back to his last redoubt at Ulm. Now holed up in Ulm following the disastrous Battle of Elchingen and later the Battle of Haslach-Jungingen, Mack's erratic and contradictory orders were now irking the Austrian high commanders much as his subordinates. After all, Mack had never been quite the same.
All these damn town names in Central Europe. What the hell, Germany? It's so confusing.
Austrian high commanders, much as his subordinates. After all, Mack had never been quite the same since that head injury he suffered during the Austro-Turkish War a decade or so previously, when several heroic breakout attempts ended in failure, and now with Ulm besieged by Napoleon's forces, a blustering Mack declared that he would eat his last horse before he would surrender. Unfortunately, the hapsless Habsburg commander did not realize that in saying so, he was confessing that the town and his army were without provisions. Now, all Napoleon had to do was wait it out, freeing up a lot of his forces to deal with the Russian general Kutuzov, who was now digging himself in around Vienna. Finally, bowing to the inevitable, Mack surrendered personally to Napoleon Bonaparte on the 21st of October.
How is saying I'll eat my own horse? I get how you could get the feeling that what he's saying is he doesn't have much provision, but how do you know he's not saying, how do you know they don't have provision and then after eating that he'll eat his own horse? So was it like a blunder of speech or
forces to deal with the Russian general Kutuzov, who was now digging himself in around Vienna. Finally, bowing to the inevitable, Mack surrendered personally to Napoleon Bonaparte on the 21st of October 1805, almost a month after the start of the Ulm campaign. With the exception of a small contingent which marched to escape to Bohemia, almost the entire Austrian army had now capitulated, leaving the gates of Vienna wide open to Napoleon's formidable Grand Army. As for Mack, although he and many of his officers were released on condition that they no longer waged war against France, he was sentenced by his own side to 2 years in prison for cowardice, which is probably the Habsburgs' coded language for being a bit of a blithering idiot, really.
Hey, big boy.
Bonaparte's troops were able to wander virtually unimpeded to Vienna and to then saunter through the city gates with almost no resistance, something over which we shall draw a polite veil. This was the 11th of November, 1805. What ensued following the occupation of Vienna could then be described as a game of cat and mouse, with Napoleon's forces chasing what was left of the Austrian army, along with the Russians, nominally led by their general, Mikhail Ilyanovich Kutuzov. It soon began to dawn on Napoleon that his supply lines were becoming rather stretched, and that despite the massive army he had sent to the east, they could easily be outnumbered, especially if Prussia, now certainly vexed by his incursions into its territory, finally decided to pile in. He would need a strategy, perhaps a bit of psychological warfare would be in order. He quickly ordered his generals, Soult, Laon, and Murat, to take a small town just to the south of Brno in what is now the Czech Republic, as well as securing its connections to the regional capital, Olmütz. That small town was Austerlitz, and it would lure the surging Austro-Russian allies into a false sense of security, which he would bolster by generally letting it be known to the enemy that he wished to avoid a confrontation at all costs. He did this in particular by subtly presenting the Russian envoy, Prince Peter Petrovich Dolgorukov, with a flurry of nervous twitches, which left the Tsarist prince with little doubt that the French emperor was silently browning his pants. But crucially, Napoleon intentionally weakened his position around the overlooking Pratzen Heights with the express intention of luring the enemy to occupy them, as well as the town of Austerlitz itself. This, combined with his carefully seeded intelligence that his army was demoralized, without provisions, sick, and generally unfit for combat, did just the job. Edged on by a bombastic and militarily naive Tsar, Alexander I, the Russians rose to the bait. In a brilliant Napoleonic piece of military maneuvering described as elastic withdrawal, Bonaparte sent his general Laon with 17,000 men.
I like that name a lot. Just building up kinetic
to hold the Olmütz. Bonaparte sent his general Laon with 17,000 men to hold the Olmütz-Brno highway. Meanwhile, Soult with 22,000 men were stationed nearby, ready to storm the Pratzen Heights, while Bernadotte with 9,000 men swept to the north to back them up. Defoe with 10,000 tired men, following a grueling 130-kilometer march, dug in Telnitz, and
that's a hell of a lineup right there. Those four.
Sokolnitz to the west. The trap had been laid. All they had to do was wait. Under a completely false sense of security, the Austro-Russian army hurriedly swarmed to what they thought were abandoned positions around Austerlitz. The Russian general Bagration, with 15,000 men, backed up by the cavalry of Liechtenstein with 5,000 men and horses, went to the north, not noting that Lannes was hiding out there. However, the main group of 40,000 men drove to the south under the command of Buxhausen, Doktorov, Kainmever, Langeron, and Przydysevetsky. Unfortunately for the Russians, their commander was frequently overridden by Tsar Alexander I, who thought that his divine right to rule also gave him military genius. At about 4 o'clock on the 1st of December 1805, Napoleon Bonaparte brought his binoculars to his eyes, yes, they had binoculars back in 1805, and observed with satisfaction the gathering enemy troops on the Pratzen Heights. Gritting his teeth, he mumbled to himself, but in French, "Before tomorrow, I'll own this army." Contrary to the carefully seeded intelligence, Napoleon's troops could not have been in better spirits. That night, he even encouraged them to light bonfires so they could party until the early hours. Of course, the emperor knew that the Russians would be thinking that the French army had decided to retreat in panic and were burning whatever they couldn't take with them. Early on a frosty December morning, Bonaparte carefully placed his troops in a number of carefully chosen positions just out of sight of the
Did Napoleon mean to give that impression of burning your own equipment? Because if so, that is pretty smart.
Enemy. As the sun rose on the 2nd of December 1805, the conflagration ignited explosively, metaphorically at least. Battling to the north, Laon and Murat easily took Bagration and Liechtenstein's positions. Meanwhile, Soult's men were straining at their leads to take the Pratzen Heights, but Napoleon made them wait. Let the Russians evacuate the heights first to bring reinforcements to their units battling elsewhere. Then, the French would strike their fatal blow. When Napoleon finally gave Soult the order to change, as if by magic the fog lifted to bathe them in glorious winter sunlight, like a pack of wolves, Soult's 22,000 men quickly scampered up into the heights, taking hills one at a time.
I noticed that what are considered like the best marshals, the best quotes, of Napoleon marshals are sort of all present here, and so I'm assuming their reputation as great marshals was built at this battle. Except you don't have Suchet here, so.
Tarnitz and Sarkonitz would bring allied reinforcements to their beleaguered colleagues in the heights, conveniently relieving Devoe in the fighting that followed his ambush on them. But by 11 o'clock, the hills were taken by Bonaparte's troops. Not wishing to lay this to rest, the Russians took decisive action and staged a counterattack just after midday. Although 2 regiments at first managed to lay everything to waste in what can only be described as a scorched earth policy, Napoleon, holding his nerve, quickly sent in Morland's squadron of grenadiers in his own counterattack, or we suppose that should be a counterattack. Everything intensified, and events now follow each other with almost an alarming rapidity. Morland charges, and when Morland himself is killed, they are quickly backed up by Darman, who famously thrusts into battle, shouting, again in French, "Let's make the wives of St. Petersburg cry." And, well, many wives of St. Petersburg would soon be crying. After a second charge, this time led by Abt, the Russian prince and general Nikolai Vasilovich Repnin is taken prisoner. This is quite a coup for Napoleon, and when he later expresses some concern about the prince's badly bleeding wounds, the injured Russian general simply replies, "It's only a scratch." Meanwhile, Buxhouwden, now holed up in Telnitz, is slowly entrapped by the massive pincer movement of Soult and Devoe, while in a small chapel just to the south of the heights, Napoleon...
I'm thinking of the Holy Grail, Monty Python, of course.
...of Soult and Devoe, while in a small chapel just to the south of the heights, Napoleon receives the Baron of Wimpfen, a French mercenary and officer in the Russian army. He hands the Baron a glass of wine. French wine, he adds with emphasis. The battle is over, and night falls. 1,500 of Napoleon's men are lost and 6,000 are wounded. The Russian and Austrian casualties are at least twice that number. But perhaps most importantly, the tactically brilliant victory of Napoleon Bonaparte on the first anniversary of his coronation now puts an end, once and for all, to the Third Coalition. And this all happened so quickly that Prussia only knew about the events after the battle had been lost, as Napoleon declared to his men, "If you say I was at Austerlitz, people will reply, 'Here is a brave and noble man.'" Friedrich Wilhelm III's ultimatum lost all meaning. Although Austerlitz was without a doubt Napoleon's greatest victory, and the Third Coalition was well and truly thrashed, with the Prussians and Austrians respectively signing the treaties of Schönbrunn and Pressburg soon thereafter, the British would continue to battle on. Napoleon's empire would not reach its apogee until 1812, 7 years later, but it would take a disastrous Russian campaign and the Battle of Waterloo, led by Wellington in 1815, almost 10 years after Austerlitz, for it to end for good. Following Waterloo, Napoleon would be exiled to the island of St. Helena by the British. Today, the legacy of Napoleon Bonaparte's victory in Austerlitz proudly endures in some French place names. The Gare d'Austerlitz is a famous Parisian station, while Strasbourg, the seat of the European Parliament and Court of Human Rights, has a Place d'Austerlitz, a major town square. Much of Napoleon's monumental architecture is also still standing to this day, including the Arc de Triomphe, which he commissioned following the triumphal victory at Austerlitz, and which is situated at the ends of Les Champs-Élysées, the famous massive east-west Parisian avenue. Because Napoleon was very much a product of the French Revolution, so was, by extension, his triumphal arch. It is therefore perhaps ironic that the monument was occupied by a more recent revolutionary force, the Gilets jaunes, during the frequently violent protests of 2018. So I really hope you found that video interesting. If you did, please do hit that thumbs up button below. Don't forget to subscribe. And as always, thank you for watching.
Thank you for making amazing video again. Such a great channel. And geographics, biographics, war graphics, a few other, like Shadow something. Great channel. Yeah, love learning about Napoleon. Still have a lot to learn, especially about the earlier years, kind of pre-Austerlitz. Gotta go back more into that for sure. All right, great video. See you guys next time. Trying to get back upstairs. See ya.